Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Heidi from My Reading Life, here today to do my top nonfiction reads of 2017. Nonfiction reading went very well for me in 2017. I think it might have been one of the best years ever for me as far as nonfiction went. I think 34% of my reading overall in the year was nonfiction, which is awesome. I'm really excited about that and really excited by some of the books that I read this year, and I want to share with you the top books that I read in this genre. And appropriately enough for this video, I have chosen to wear my Global Warming is Real t-shirt because I felt it was appropriate for the nonfiction topic. So let's just get to it and talk about the books. The first book I'd like to talk about is the best sort of comedian-based collection of essays that I read this year. It's called I'm Judging You, A Do Better Manual by Luvvie Ajayi. This is a sort of a manners in the 21st century kind of books. It's how to be better, how we should all be better as a culture at being nicer to one another and not being so rude to one another. It's extremely funny. I listened to it on audiobook. The author reads it herself. She is a comedian and a cultural critic. She has a blog, I believe. And she is the kind of person that sort of points out the foibles of the media and our culture in everyday life, and how being a black woman in America, she can sort of take that on and point out to us how we're doing it wrong and give us all the side eyes in the world for our bad behavior. And this was an extremely funny book. I really enjoyed it. I read it towards the beginning of the year, and I remember that I was listening to it on audio, and I was taking a walk with my dog, and I was just laughing out loud as I walk. And I live in a very rural area, so I'm like in the middle of the woods by myself with my dog, just sort of busting a gut laughing. So highly recommend I'm Judging You by Luvvie Ajayi if you like that sort of thing. The next book I read this on ebook, and I've talked about it recently. This is Evicted by Desmond. This is a deep dive into what housing looks like for the poverty-stricken in our nation. This book focuses on Milwaukee. The author actually goes and lives in Milwaukee in some of the poorer areas of town and interviews and lives with people that are going through the process basically of trying to live a life without having permanent housing and without having secure housing, and what that looks like and feels like, and how this could be in such a wealthy country as the United States, how it could be that people could live without housing security, and why that isn't more. It also questions, why isn't this more of an issue in American politics? Why aren't we really looking at the fact that so many people don't have secure housing, and how that impacts everything else in their lives, from education to the workforce, to the culture of our cities and our urban areas in America. I did a pretty long review on this in one of my wrap-ups in the last month or so, so I won't go on about it here, but this was an excellent book. Highly recommend it to anybody that likes sort of a journalistic take on an issue. The next book was also another sort of journalistic take on an issue, but this was more specific. It's called American Fire, and the author is Monica Hesse. I read this in December, and I was just blown away by how good this book was. It sort of takes a crime, in this case a series of arson events, in a rural community in Virginia, and takes us through the whole thing of, as the fires start to be set in late 2012, I believe, and they go into the spring of 2013, and I think there are like 80 some fires set in all, and we follow the firefighters as they try to deal with the fact that they're being called out every single night to fight fires. These are rural volunteer fire departments, and then we follow the suspect and their lives, and what's going on socially with those folks. And then we end up with the court case at the end after the suspected arsonists are captured. Excellent book, really propelling narrative for nonfiction. This is the best of sort of narrative nonfiction style writing. It reads almost like fiction. A lot of there's some very interesting characters that you encounter in this book, and you just want to know what happened. I really enjoyed this book. And then the last book that I actually listened to this on audio that I want to share with you from my top nonfiction reads was Ta-Nehisi Coates' We Were 8 Years in Power. This is a very important book, I think, but also one that certainly expanded my thinking on politics and social justice and racial inequality in our country. Ta-Nehisi Coates is one of the best thinkers and writers on these topics today in America. He is a staff writer for The Atlantic magazine, and this book is a collection of 8 of his essays that were originally published in The Atlantic, but the book also includes an essay before each article that sort of puts the essay into context and brings in Ta-Nehisi Coates' personal life into what he was writing about at the time, what he was thinking about at the time, and how this collection of 8 articles shows his progression in his own thinking about these topics over the 8 years that Obama was president. And then we end up with the last essay being dealing with President Trump and what that means in terms of having had Barack Obama as president and now having basically, I think the essay is titled Our First White President. And so it just sort of wraps it up neatly for the whole progression of thinking and political events over the last 8 years. Very powerful book, very important book, and one that I hope a lot of people end up reading. And the last 4 books I have here in physical copies, and these were particularly excellent books, and I will end up, the last 2 books that I talk about are tied for my best reads of the year. But starting with number 4, for the top 4, we have Hidden Figures by Margot Lee Shetterly. I read this book, I think in the end of the summer, beginning of the fall. It's about the Black women mathematicians that helped launch our space race and get us to the moon. This was fascinating. Basically, during World War II, all of the men were off fighting in the war, and and the government was trying to deal with getting us up and ready for flight and space travel and all of that sort of technology. And they needed mathematicians because at the time we didn't have computers. So they needed somebody to run the numbers and crunch the numbers and basically be human computers. And so they began to look into hiring women, and they hired lots of white women as well. But this story tracks how Black women mathematicians were brought into the early days in NASA and up through, I think this book ends in present day, but sort of basically the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s is where we're concentrating on this story. And it was simply fascinating. It was amazing to me how it's still amazing to me. It's amazing to me how much talent we squander in this country because we're so caught up in race and class and all these divisions between ourselves, instead of saying, who are the best people to do the job? Who are the smartest people that can get us to the goals that we want to reach? And this book, Hidden Figures, really shows how Black women mathematicians helped this country reach its goals of flight and space travel and all these things, all this technology, and how they were the best people to do the job and how they did it with grace and dignity under appalling circumstances, how they were not treated well in the beginning, but they continued to do their work and do it well until finally people started to recognize the contributions that they had given. And I think this is a really important piece of our history, and I wish that it was more celebrated. And I hope that this book and then the movie that came after it help people understand how women, and particularly black women, helped really propel this country into the position that it's in today. Excellent book. The next one is a collection of essays. It's the Best American Science and Nature Writing 2016. This was edited by Amy Stewart. I've talked about this several times on this channel. I've tabbed, here some of my favorite essays, articles in this collection. This one is Why Are Sports Bras So Terrible? Excellent question. There's one in here, The Siege of Miami, which talks about how climate change is influencing flooding events in coastal cities, in particular Miami, and how we really, as a country and as individual political units, have not started to deal with the fact that our infrastructure is going to be underwater, if not all the time, then a lot of the time. And the money that we spent repairing things after these flooding events happen, without dealing with the underlying issue, which is we have built infrastructure in areas where we should not have built it, and now we're having to deal with the consequences, was fascinating. And then the last one that I've tabbed here is the really big one by Catherine Schultz. It was originally published in the New Yorker, and it's all about earthquakes, and the point of it's not if an earthquake happens in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, but when an earthquake happens in the Pacific Northwest, and what impact that will have on civilization, basically, in the United States. Basically everything to do with human civilization, infrastructure, people, environment, all of these things, how it's going to be impacted, and talks a little bit about the events in Japan with the tsunami and the originating earthquake that caused the tsunami, and how similar things could happen in the United States, and how it was scary, I have to say. I had not considered, earthquakes are scary anyway, but the overarching implications of that article were extremely scary to me. And now on to the last two top nonfictions that I read in 2017. The first one is Hunger, A Memoir of My Body by Roxane Gay. I know this ended up on a lot of folks' top lists for 2017. I loved this. This was such an emotional and heart-wrenching read. I love Roxane Gay's writing style. I love her. I just love the way she writes. She really gets to the heart of the matter in a very direct way, and I like her style very much, and I think it works extremely well in nonfiction. And this, her memoir of how she got to where she is in her body. She experienced terrible violence when she was a young girl, and that has impacted her physical self ever since. Roxane Gay is a fat woman. She will tell you she's a fat woman, and this book is about how she moves through the world, both physically and emotionally, being a fat black woman. And this book is just so incredibly powerful. You can tell how much I loved it by how much I tabbed it. I tabbed it and underlined throughout, and I just want to read a passage that sort of shows, I think, the power and strength of this book. This is what most girls are taught, that we should be slender and small. We should not take up space. We should be seen and not heard. And if we are seen, we should be pleasing to men, acceptable to society. And most women know this, that we are supposed to disappear, but it's something that needs to be said loudly over and over again so that we can resist surrendering to what is expected of us. It's a great book. You should read it. And then the very last book that I want to talk about is one that I've gushed about many times on this channel before, and it's Lab Girl by Hope Jahren. This book is a memoir of Jaren's life growing up, becoming a scientist, and it's just, I related to a lot. I work in the science field. I related a lot to her experiences in college and her experiences getting a job in science, and then her experiences with the whole grant writing and like having to chase the money in order to do the work. I related very much to that. A whole massive piece of this story is her relationship with her best friend, a man named Bill. They meet in when Jahren is a graduate student and Bill is an undergrad, and they just create this incredibly strong personal bond that is not romantic. It is a true friendship, and they continue to work together, and they work together still. They build labs together, and they, fight through having no money and having, Jahren deals with mental health issues, and they deal with that, and he has extreme poverty, and they deal with that. It's just beautiful. And then we follow along as Jahren, finds love and gets married and gets pregnant, and just beautiful writing. I loved the descriptions of Jaren's work. She is her science work deals with plants and soil. I found that fascinating. Some people might not like it, but I found it really interesting. I cried multiple times through this book. I loved the style of it. I loved the writing. It very much spoke to me. I think it's beautiful. I've heard people say that the audio is excellent for this book as well, very emotional, but it was excellent as a physical read as well. So I would highly recommend Lab Girl to everyone, and it was my favorite nonfiction read of 2017. So that's it. That's the best nonfiction I read in 2017. I really hope that in 2018 I continue on the trend and read a lot more great nonfiction stuff. And I would definitely say that being on BookTube has increased my nonfiction reading and has brought to my attention many books that I may have otherwise missed for whatever reasons. So here's to 2018, hoping that the nonfiction reading really continues to go great guns, and hope that you all have been reading some great nonfiction as well, and I will talk to you later.